Okay, it's 6 o'clock, so we will go ahead and get started. First, I'm going to introduce our speaker for tonight. So tonight we have Domnique, is it Byrd?
Yep.
Okay, Domnique Byrd, and you didn't study birds, what?
I know, right? I went for the mammal route.
Okay, so Domnique, or as he likes to be called, Nick, is using camera traps and space-to-event models to estimate densities of elk and white-tailed deer populations on the Fort Riley Military Reservation, which is about 40,000 hectares in Kansas, USA. He is also comparing results obtained from these methods to density estimates derived from distance sampling and aerial survey methods. Nick was an infantry squad leader from 2010 to 2016 with 2 overseas deployments and has worked several field technician and wildlife research gigs before starting graduate school. Nick received his BS degree in fisheries, wildlife conservation, and environmental biology, along with a minor in agronomy from K-State. In his spare time, he enjoys Brazilian jiu-jitsu, archery, hunting, and waterfowl hunting in the Midwest. So I'd like to welcome Nick here for the presentation, and you can go ahead and take it away.
Yeah, thank you, Amy. So a little bit of an update. I also was doing occupancy modeling for winter habitat use by elk. And so I'm gonna cover that on the first portion, and then we can roll into the space to event modeling, if that's all right. All right, I'm going to share my screen and then run through the PowerPoint. Okay, so this first portion is going to be over winter habitat use by a restored elk population in the tall grass prairie. So to start off, Rocky Mountain elk populations have been reintroduced across North America, including Fort Riley, which is in the tallgrass prairie region of northeast Kansas. And we have limited understanding of how elk are using this prairie landscape under multiple different habitat regimes. Elk are also known as wapiti, and they are mammalian cervids that range anywhere from 500 to 1,000 pounds. They are a generalist herbivore species, which means that they can both browse and graze. So they will eat grasses, shrubs, and other woody plants. Their diets can vary depending on the habitat and the season, and they can shape ecosystems through their interactions with vegetation. Elk also are a economical benefit through hunting tags and licenses, and they also have an intrinsic value for wildlife enthusiasts. So we can use occupancy models, which can reveal habitat use decisions by elk during wintering seasons at Fort Riley. And this is important because food resources are limited in winter. Food plots have been harvested and other wildlife species are consuming them. And then this is a time period where elk have gone through their rut. And so their energy reserves have been depleted. For bull elk and for mothering cows, this is also a time when their lactation is decreasing from December to February. So Fort Riley undergoes multiple different habitat management techniques. They have a bunch of diverse food plots, which also can act as fire breaks along the perimeter of certain parts of the installation. Food plots can include alfalfa, corn, sorghum, soybean, and wheat. They maintain and improve grasslands through hay leases, and they also have go-back grasslands incentives. So areas that were once cultivated or used for military training purposes are now being restored back to prairie. And they also do timber stand improvements in the sense that they will remove unwanted species, and when necessary, they will plant desired species. They can control for noxious weeds such as Sericea lespedeza, and they also control for woody encroachment, and they will do that through either burning, mechanical, or chemical controls. They also go through a 2 to 3 year burn rotation, which they usually do in stages for heterogeneity, which also provides good plant succession rates. And they usually burn anywhere from August to April to avoid natal periods for wildlife species. Again, it's unclear how elk use these areas in Fort Riley in winter. So for our objectives, we wanted to gain an understanding of how restored elk populations uses this prairie landscape, which is undergoing multiple habitat management techniques, and it has multiple military operations with refuge areas within the installation. So for our predictions, we predicted that elk habitat use will be centered around food plots. Elk are going to use off-limits areas as a source of refuge. Elk will use areas closer to permanent water sources, and elk are going to more likely occur at sites more recently burned than unburned. As a concurrent photo, these are the Black Hawk helicopters that we had used for our aerial census surveys for elk in January of 2023. So for our study area, Fort Riley is just under 41,000 hectares. It's located in northeast Kansas. It has off-limits areas in this eastern quadrant. It's about 6,000 hectares. And in the northwest quadrant, it's about 2,500 hectares. These are impact areas, which are subject to military ordnance and small arms fire. So they are off-limits to hunters and recreationists. However, elk can maneuver through these areas relatively unrestricted. We also excluded the southernmost portion, which was the garrison area, which is comprised mostly of administrative buildings and military housing. So for the area that we were able to survey, Fort Riley is comprised of 74% grassland, 21% woody encroachment. 1% of that is food plots, and the remaining 4% is either going to be developed, quarry, or fire breaks. Elk were first reintroduced to Fort Riley in 1986. By 1994, the amount of reintroduced elk donated to Fort Riley grew up to 54. And then that population bred and grew up to 300. And in the year 2000, it was reduced down to approximately 125. They reduced it down through hunting tags because of neighboring crop damage and complaints from local farmers. So they decided to give back to the community, issue out tags, and let military and civilians be able to harvest those elk. We had 149 random survey points, which are depicted as these red dots. These survey points were already established by Fort Riley's Environmental Division, so we were very lucky to be able to go ahead and use their transects and their survey points that they had already established. And elk hunting seasons are in segments ranging from September to December, and they did not overlap our survey season. For methods, we use camera traps and occupancy models for this portion. Camera traps are a passive, non-invasive way to gain data and intel on wildlife species, and we just use simple game trail cameras. For occupancy models, it uses detection and non-detection data. We used it for a single season. It considers the probability of detecting a species if it is present, and it's used to assist in identifying critical areas for species use. We didn't use occupancy models in the traditional method, as in do or don't they occur here. Rather, we were looking for patterns of habitat use while trying to control for detection. So from those random survey points that we had already established, we set a single unbaited camera trap on the closest structure at a 1 meter height. We used a combination of time-lapse and motion sensing photos. We used these settings for our space to event models, and we used just daily detection histories from that data for our occupancy models. And for our occupancy models, we created a 36-day detection history from the 3rd of January to the 7th of February. After we were able to collect our cameras, we then transferred all of our photo data to a free online program called Wildlife Insights. It's free and open access, and it uses artificial intelligence to categorize and tag photos. These AI models were produced by Google, and they can detect over 1,000 species in underneath a fraction of a second. And we were able to, the models use patterns, textures, and colors for recognition, and it has an accuracy of over 90% when it comes to detecting if the photo has a presence, the photo has an absence, and the photo has the correct species. So to ensure that all of our photos were tagged correctly, myself and other technicians and other helpers manually went through all of our photos just to ensure that all of the photos were correctly tagged. We were also able to tag other species such as white-tailed deer, bobcats, coyotes, turkeys, skunks, and some other avian species for future studies. For anybody else that wanted to use it, or if K-State had potential plans for anything in the future for them. For land cover data, we were able to gather land cover data from the Kansas Biological Survey out of Kansas University. And we had created a 250-meter radius circular buffer around centered on each one of our sites. We chose this metric because it was consistent and comparable to previous studies for habitat use for elk. And from our buffers, we were able to extract proportions of woody vegetation, food plots, and grassland. And we also measured, centered from our points, of Euclidean distance to the nearest impact area and permanent water source. So for example, on the eastern portion where you see the red dot 61 centered on the eastern portion, we measured that distance to the nearest impact area, so it would have been to the right, and we did that to the nearest water source to see if these areas were being used more than others. We also wanted to create variables for burn history, so we created these polygons for the past 10 years, categorizing burn date and burn frequency. And in regards to the same buffer size, if the proportion of the site was less than 20% burned within our 250-meter buffer, it was considered below our cutoff and was not counted. We then went further back in time to find a proportion that had met our cutoff of at least 20% or more, and then established that as our most recent burn date. And for burn frequency, we just simply counted the amount of times an area was burned, dating back for the past 10 years. And we expected elk to occur at more sites more recently burned with a higher burn frequency. We created 2 detection covariants in an attempt to control for detection. We assessed detection models to find the best fit. And so we created day of year to see if that had an effect. And we also created days active. We created days active because not all cameras were out for the same amount of time. Some cameras had to be picked up early because of prescribed burns. So we created days active to see if that had an effect for detection. We also used single season occupancy models to assess landscape scale factors important for elk habitat use. And we ranked our 27 models using AICC, which was corrected for a small sample size. We used RStudio and then program package unmarked. For results, we had a total of 1,173 photos of elk over 4,854 trap nights with a naive occupancy of 0.26, which simply just means that out of 149 sites, 38 of them were occupied. So our best detection model was our constant model, and we used that to fit all of our occupancy models that you see below. We had 5 occupancy models that were competitive, and our second ranked model, which was a single effect model, was the most parsimonious. It was the best fit, and this covariate was also present in all of our competitive models. Models including days since burn contributed to 0.89 of the model weights within all of our models, which tells us that elk are likely to use areas recently burned in wintering months. Adding any additional covariance caused our 95% confidence intervals to overlap 0, or the estimates were uninterpretable, which basically was telling us that likely all of our additional covariates were just piggybacking off the explanatory power of days since burn. So we wanted to create a plot to try to make this look pretty and make sense. So this is just a plot that says, as days since burn increases, occupancy probability for elk decreases. And we were thinking, why could this be? And we were thinking that it could be that since areas that are more recently burned have tender regrowth forage, that forage is more palatable and it contains more digestible fiber. These grasses that are regrowing usually have a higher protein content. Minerals from the ash can contain calcium, phosphorus, potassium, and magnesium, which could be supplemental for bone health. Also, not just grasslands, but shrubby areas that have been top killed, their regrowth from those sprouts are very dense in minerals and vitamins. And within all of this forage, the water content that's freshly growing is higher than old dried out vegetation. Within our study period, we did have warm days and about an inch of rain, which could have contributed to regrowth. And again, the reason why we think this makes sense is that during our time frame of sampling, this is after the rut, bull elk have lost a lot of fat reserves from hunting pressure and chasing cows. They are also could have used muscle or had muscle loss when they depleted their fat reserves, and they're also recovering from injuries. And so it might be beneficial to search for these areas for growth, for forage. High quality habitat could also be beneficial to prevent productivity declines in mother's milk production, which is reduced from December to February, and juveniles who are transitioning from milk to vegetation are also their fat reserves are also becoming depleted. And so overall, what we see is elk appear to be using areas with high quality forage in a continual growth stage. So for the conclusion for occupancy, contrary to our hypothesis, off-limit areas and food plots weren't well supported in our models for elk. This could be because during our survey time, it was after the hunting season and military training activities weren't really being established at this time. So perhaps elk weren't feeling human pressure. So they weren't having to seek refuge. Also, we weren't able to put cameras within these off-limit areas, and we weren't able to have GPS collars on elk. So we don't for sure know that they weren't using these areas. We can only simply suggest that during our time that we weren't able to support that. And for food plots, we were thinking that since food plots have been harvested at this time, and we had estimated in our STE models, there could be a high abundance of white-tailed deer that could be non-directly out competing elk for these resources. And elk have evolved to be generalist species that can browse and graze in order to just be efficient for forage. They might just be choosing these most recently burned areas. We also weren't able to find that water was well supported, which could just be that our scale for measuring water was too coarse, that we weren't able to account for all of the puddles that could have been accumulated in ditches and stuff like that elk could have been using. But we were able to find that elk are using most recently burned areas, which is supported by multiple studies, and continuing an active fire regime will likely benefit elk on Fort Riley. And with that, we're going to transition over to our space to event models. And so we're going to be comparing multiple techniques to estimate elk and white-tailed deer abundances. Excuse me, I'm going to take a sip of water. So for our introduction, precise estimates of population abundances are necessary to develop harvest regulations and manage populations. Traditionally, biologists have used census surveys and/or distance samplings to estimate abundances of Rocky Mountain elk and white-tailed deer populations. And these methods can be time-intensive, expensive, and can present logistical challenges during certain times of the year for wildlife managers. For our space to event models, we use the same camera traps, which again are passive, and we had used motion detection and time-lapse intervals for our study. And for space to event modeling, there are a couple of assumptions. One, the cameras are randomly distributed. Cameras were triggered to take motion or time lapse as well as motion sensor. In the past, they have either used or, so it was either strictly time lapse or usually strictly motion triggered. We decided to use both. The reason why is because for space to event modeling to work, it runs off a Poisson distribution. So basically, cameras are taking pictures in a synchronous fashion. So at 12 o'clock, all cameras are taking pictures. At 12:30, all cameras are taking pictures. And so on and so on. Our cameras weren't equipped with that. Once you turn the camera on, that is when the time lapse began. And so we decided to use motion sensing as well in order to say that we were constantly sampling. And so if a photo was or wasn't taken during a certain time lapse, it would have been taken during motion triggered. Also, for another assumption, it's insensitive to anything past 50 meters and rate of movement. So the developers of this established a cutoff of 50 meters to be able to account for the viewable area of what we are sampling from. And they had also developed time to event modeling, which inquires the rate of movement of an animal. And since we were detecting two different species, we figured it would be more efficient to stick with the space to event modeling, which doesn't account for animal rate of movement. These are the papers that we were referring to for our space to event models. The first one was the development of these three novel methods. So the first one being time to event, second being space to event, and the third being an instantaneous. The second paper had used only motion sensing photos with their space to event models, and they had compared it to genetic surveys, and they had found that they were within 22% of one another, and their 95% confidence intervals overlapped in the 2 of the 3 years of their study period. We also referred to Anna's paper, Best Practices to Account for Capture Probability and the Viewable Area. So in all of the previous papers that we were able to reference, none of them were able to accurately, or I shouldn't say accurately, we're able to estimate the total viewable area. So basically they're saying that the area within the lens of the camera up to 50 meters was not obstructed. So they were able to see the entire area. But as we know, when you go out in nature, there's usually vegetation or some sort of obstruction that can block an area. So we created a tool to be able to measure that in some sense to try to eliminate bias for that. And this fourth paper was just another paper that had researched using previous picture data to estimate multiple species within northeastern Washington, and they were able to get the modeling to work and compare their estimates to other different surveys that they were able to attain. So for our objectives and predictions, our goal was to use camera trap data and space to event models to concurrently estimate elk and deer populations on Fort Riley, and then compare the precision of our SDE estimates to aerial census estimates of elk and distance sampling estimates for deer within the installation. And for our predictions, our methods using motion detection for unmarked animals while accounting for viewable area will decrease any potential bias of overestimating an abundance. So for our methods, we needed to find our camera lens angle. This is because it's part of the equation of being able to account for the area you are using or you are measuring. So for this, I contacted Bushnell. When we got in the cameras, the manual one said the lens angle was at 45 degrees, and I just wanted to confirm that with the manufacturer. The manufacturer told me that the lens angle was actually 40 degrees. And so I figured, well, let's just try to measure it. And I'm not a technician of lens angles. So I had gotten a double bubble tripod right here to make sure that the camera was set level. And you can't really see it, but there are some cones laid out in 3 feet intervals along this hash line. And so we basically took a picture using the camera, uploaded it, and I had two different compasses that I shot azimuths with. So I would look where the left limit and the right limit was for our picture, and then shoot an azimuth, and then subtract it, and then do it multiple times and try to get an average, and then see if we could estimate whether or not we could, or whether or not we could find a lens angle this way. And having done this multiple times during the study, we were able to get an average of 38 for 45 meters. I should have went 5 meters or 5 yards more to reach 50 meters, but I didn't think of it. So hindsight is 2020, but we were able to get an average close to the 40-degree angle that was quoted to me from Bushnell. One thing that was a little concerning is that as I got closer, it seemed like our average for our lens angle decreased. And so I was asking around, and it could be focal lens, either barrel distribution or a pin cushion distortion effect. So I didn't quite know what to do with that. And developing a topper for every single yardage for every single camera would have been too extensive. Previous studies had usually just used a blanket lens angle, and they were confident in using that one angle. So we decided that since we had talked to Bushnell, they established it was 40. Our measurement was close to 40. That was the lens angle that we decided to use. And so I came up with this camera topper, which has an lens angle 40 degrees. And we were able to put this on top of each one of our cameras during installation to try to be able to capture the viewable area within our view shed. And so basically what that means is, so this is a range card that we had used in the Army for gun positions. I figured I could just repurpose it. So usually if the gun position was right here, you would just lay out the terrain, and in certain meter increments, we would basically have 5 meters, 10, 15, all the way out. Since our max range was 50, we had it out through here, and each one of these proportions is equal to 6.67 degrees of our lens angle. And so we have 6 of them, which equal up to 40. And then we would account for all of obstructions within our view shed. From that, we were able to calculate and measure each one of our sections, and then account for how much viewable area we were actually observing. So for a full unobstructed view shed, it was 872.6 meters squared. And we were then able to say that is an open view shed, and then account for any obstructions from there on. And we also collected other data that could have been pertinent later on. For methods, we took one picture every 30 minutes, as well as any motion detections. We established a 2-foot stake at a max range of 50 meters for our range cutoff. If a wood line was so dense at 25 meters that we couldn't see past that, then we established that as our max range cutoff. Also, if the terrain were to drop, like we were on a ridge or a hillside at, let's say, 40 meters, we would establish that as our range cutoff. And we also use space and time package in RStudio. again, we had transferred all of our photo data to Wildlife Insights using the same methods as before. And so for our results, we were able to have 1,173 photos for elk over our full trap nights, and then just over 12,000 for deer for our full trap nights. Since it took about 2 to 3 days to install the cameras, not all cameras were taking photos within the same time. So we had to condense our trap nights. We condensed it to where it was 30 minutes after the last camera was installed to 20 minutes prior to the first camera being shut off. And with that, we had our condensed data depicted right here of 948 pictures of elk and just over 11,000 pictures of deer. From our spotlight abundance surveys that we did on November 16th, 17th, and the 20th of 2022, white-tailed deer abundances were estimated at 1,526 on Fort Riley. And with our space to event models, we estimated 2,290 with a little bit of overlap in our confidence intervals. For elk, the aerial Blackhawk survey that we had done came to a total of 102 total elk. And with our STE abundance estimates, we were able to estimate 197 elk. It should be noted that during our aerial census survey, a herd had apparently migrated just off post, and it was a herd of 100 elk, about 100 elk that had hit an ag field just outside the boundaries of Fort Riley, so they couldn't technically be counted. We wanted to ensure some sort of accuracy, and so when we had talked to Anna, she suggested bootstrapping. And so we had bootstrapped our method, and then we had bootstrapped previous methods to see if they were comparable. So this first is just our results without any bootstrap. And then we had used 59 iterations in 30-second increments after our initial time that we began. We began our analysis 30 seconds, and then we started it over, began a minute, started it over, began a minute and a half, and we were able to do that for 59 iterations using our methods, and did that same thing using a sampling length of 1 second. So again, just to try to make this make sense, I guess, we are stating that for sampling occasions, we are sampling every 30 minutes, so 1,800 seconds, with a sampling length of the same time since we are using motion detection. And with previous methods, they were using every 30 minutes with a sampling length of 1 second because they weren't using motion, and all cameras were taking pictures within the same time using a snapshot in time. So that is where that 1 second is being used from. This is just a plot depicting the white-tailed deer bootstrap methods using previous methods. We were averaging, I want to say, just over 25 deer using previous methods, and about 4 elk on Fort Riley using previous methods. And then using our methods, we were able to bootstrap, and it was about the same, like 194 elk, and then about 2,250 white-tailed deer. So what we had learned was that our approach at estimating and the functional viewshed of individual cameras provided a more reliable estimate of the total area sampled, and could be incorporated in future studies using STE models. STE approaches can concurrently estimate abundances of multiple species in a study extent, and may be a cheaper alternative to single species population surveys. And it still remains unclear if STE approaches at estimating population abundances are sensitive to seasonal variation associated with biological traits such as dispersal, kit rearing, and nesting, and that could be assessed in future studies. So sampling during the wintertime, also sampling during spring and summer months, that could have an effect as well on space to event models. For our acknowledgements, we'd like to thank Fort Riley Military Reservation's Environmental Division. Without them, the study couldn't have been possible logistically. We'd like to thank Professor Hope and Drew Ricketts for their mentorship. We'd also like to thank all of our technicians and everybody who had helped set up cameras, Kansas State University, Wildlife Insights, and their technical support team, the Kansas Biological Survey, and McIntyre Stennis for providing funding. And with that, are there any questions?
All right, thank you very much, Nick. Anybody have any questions? You can either pop them in the chat or you can unmute and ask them yourself. Yes, Chuck.
Yeah, great job, Nick. I guess I have lots of questions, but the bigger question is, with the Endangered Species Act, there's always challenges on the reliability of the numbers of the species, whether there's enough there to warrant being removed from the list or whether it should remain on the list. Would your research and your methods help make that a more robust sampling? Do you think?
I think every little bit helps. I think one thing I was thinking about today is really fine-tuning the sampling occasions and sampling length to match with the area and density of cameras being set up. So I think that if we could do this again and repeat this, be able to still compare it, still give it more rigorous testing, just to provide more reliability, would help us build confidence in being able to use these methods and being able to accurately establish a population abundance from that. But I mean, anything really helps. I think that if you're able to set out cameras for a day and then leave them for a month to 2 months and then pick them up, that's more logistically feasible instead of having these long man hours and then trying to work schedules for spotlight surveys or trying to get helicopters and stuff like that. I think it provides a more logistical ease on wildlife biologists.
Amy, can I ask a follow-up question?
You sure can.
So the nice thing about Fort Riley is it's a pretty contained area, a manageable area with a pretty well-defined population. I guess, again, along the same lines, do you see this being able to be expanded to bigger, more wilderness areas?
Yes, yeah. The first study from Anna's paper was conducted in a wilderness area up in Idaho. And yeah, I think as long as you stick to cameras are being randomly placed, that that usually follows the assumptions. In the wolf paper, they did target areas that would be higher traffic, but that was again for low density wolf populations. So you might need to skew it. So if you're doing just unmarked healthy populations, maybe stick to more random areas within your study area. And if you're trying to target smaller populations, endangered species, more rare species, maybe target, it's okay to violate the assumption of complete random camera placements.
Great, thank you.
Also,
Oh, go ahead, Nick, go ahead.
Something I didn't cover, we were also able to a benefit for using small time-lapse features. We were able to account for obscurities. So in the wintertime, we had a lot of snow, a lot of frost, a lot of fog. And so we were able to see a picture, and if it was halfway obscured, we then accounted for that and then use that measurement during our deployment history. For viewable area, we then adjusted for that. So if half of our photo was unaccounted for, we didn't sample the entire area. We actually sampled only half of that. It can be kind of monotonous, but it just helped tighten our precision for the area surveyed. So that might be something else to take into consideration as well.
Okay. I was gonna ask, did you find on your camera traps anything interesting other than what you were looking for? Sometimes people get really excited when they see bobcats and stuff on their camera traps, or just different weird scenes that you've captured. Did you find anything that you thought was interesting?
We were keeping an eye out for spotted skunks, but we didn't find
Oh,
any.
yeah.
Um, yeah, we were really hoping to nab one. But later on after the survey season, they were curious about coyote abundances and stuff like that, and so we were able to very quickly, since we had all of our deployment history and all of our viewshed areas, we were able to just see, and using Wildlife Insights, we were able to just gather our coyote data from that, plug it in, and then get a abundance estimate from that. The space and time package is very user friendly. I am not a tech savvy person when it comes to RStudio, and it's just a couple lines of code, and it runs it very smoothly. So, yeah.
Hello, Amy. This is Carol. Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you, Carol.
Okay, I have a question. Nick, you had said earlier in your presentation about the elk. I wrote down using recently burned areas, and I don't know what using really means. If they're burned, what is it they're using it for?
So I have to use the word use. I can't use the word select because I don't know if they're selecting an area over a different area. So basically, we're saying use as in they occupy this area. They are using that space. And for what I could infer would be forage. Elk usually traditionally that we see Rocky Mountain elk, let's say in Colorado, in spring and summer months, they'll be higher in elevation, browsing, and then in wintering months, they will usually migrate below and then hit those meadows and pastures for grazing areas. And so Kansas doesn't have a lot of mountainous areas where elk can migrate, and so we were able to see that elk are occupying or using an area that was most recently burned. So instead of areas such as food plots, we didn't just happen to see elk occupying that area. So we say that they're occupying this area, and then we can try to infer the use out of that.
Okay, thank you.
Let me know if I messed that up, if anybody else has any corrections on that.
Okay, does
Nick,
anyone else
what-
have any other questions?
Nick, what
Jim?
percentage of your population around Fort Riley is I guess what I'm asking is how big is the elk population in the state and versus population around Fort Riley? What percentage? Do you know?
Oh, I actually don't know, but one thing to take into consideration is that the abundance estimate that we had derived is likely, it could be that elk populations could be established on Fort Riley. Their home range encompasses Fort Riley. And it's not to say that there are very likely herds surrounding Fort Riley, and their home ranges could overlap Fort Riley. So I don't have a total elk abundance estimate for the state. It would be interesting to know if anybody else is doing surveys along the perimeter and seeing if these herds have an established home range, and see how much overlap that is between Fort Riley and civilian local areas.
Chuck, do you know what the population of elk are in Kansas?
No, I'm sorry. I sure don't. Yeah, I just know that they're visible around Fort Riley, and they used to have a population down around in extreme southwest Kansas, but that population on the Cimarron grasslands, that population moved over into Colorado and Oklahoma and got harvested up pretty quick. So that's about all I know. But I do know that they have moved off Fort Riley, and I'm in agreement with Nick that they're starting to establish themselves outside the fort. I
When
guess
I
that brings up the question, Nick, when you said 100 of them had moved off the fort, I assume that was for a short period of time. Was that real recent?
Yeah, it was during January 16th, the day of the survey. We were flying two Black Hawk helicopters, and you can only do an aerial count of anything that's in the installation. And I guess one herd had migrated just off of the installation onto an ag field near the airport, and it was about anywhere from 75 to 100 elk, which would have, if they would have stayed on the fort, it would have lined up perfectly with our estimates. But they just, I don't know if the helicopters might have encouraged movement, but yeah, there was about a 7,500 off of where they.
Yeah, I think that herd was along Wildcat Creek, and I think the pictures were all over the internet. They were easy to see, and lots of people took pictures of them.
When I had went duck hunting 1 or 2 years ago, I go duck hunting up by Valley Falls north of Topeka, and it was during September on a calm day, and I clear as day heard an elk bugle. I don't know if it was a person with an elk call out in the middle of the marsh in the deep woods, or maybe it could have been an elk out there, but I have heard that an elk has been harvested out by Valley Falls within the past 5 years, so they could be moving around.
Okay, Stan had a question. He's put it in the chat here. I'll read it for you, Stan. He's asking if there's any evidence of chronic wasting disease among the restored elk population.
None that I know of on Fort Riley. I know that chronic wasting disease was first, I want to say the first case was in Colorado from a closed elk herd in, oh man, decades ago. And I know chronic wasting disease is being surveyed and reported, and it seems to be encroaching from the west to the east pretty steadily, and it's a major concern. Everything from what I've heard and seen so far, I haven't seen any evidence of CWD in an elk on Fort Riley or within, and all of the elk within our pictures looked pretty healthy. So I really hope not.
The reason I ask is the restored population in Northwest Arkansas, which has been there for quite some time, is now having significant numbers of chronic wasting. I've actually seen some of the elk down there, and it's really awful. So they're at least in Northwest Arkansas.
Man, yeah,
Okay.
I hope it doesn't get to it, because with such a relatively small population, they might be feeling constraints of bottlenecking as well, not being able to break that threshold. I know in Kentucky had a minimum population of reintroduced elk that I think was like 500, and their population was really able to flourish from that. And so if we're just trying to get to those numbers, if CWD hits it, that could be a real big hit on the population before they're able to grow.
All right. Well, I think that is good for all the questions. Thank you so much, Nick. I think it's fascinating research, and I think there's definitely more to come with a lot of these topics. And good luck to you on everything in your future here and your degree. And thanks a lot again for talking to all of us.
Yeah, thank you guys for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thanks. All right. You have a good night.
Yep, you all as well.